Oh, we got 4. Andrew Studd. Wow. Nice to see you, Andrew.
In.
Alison coming on board. Sarah McQuillan. Natasha. Geeta. It's just nice to see everybody coming on board. Oh, I've got a hand. I've got a lovely hand up and welcome. So Will Dalton, Rick Tazzini, Juliet Pratcher. Oh, I do. And Jay, nice to have you back again. Oh, it's just fun, because otherwise you just sit here in silence as people come on board. Well, you can do a few names then.
No, I wouldn't steal your thunder. Go for it, Mark.
So we'll start in a couple of seconds. We're just loading up the attendees. So Richard Waters, nice to see you. I was going to say I was teaching with Richard over the weekend, and he's back for more of me. This is frightening, Richard. Rolf, it's nice that you've got a surname and a first name the same. That's lovely. Susan Crane, nice to see you, Susan. I haven't spoken to you for a time, so nice to see you. So we've got 27 people. We'll wait, about another minute? And what we're going to do is we're going to have a bit of a talk, and then what we're going to do is open it up so that everybody can just contribute. And so we'll have a conversation. Marcus and myself will lead the conversation. Then we'll go back into talking again. And then we'll open it up to a conversation. So we're going to try and be interactive today with Zoom.
Fingers crossed. This is the first time we've used Zoom for one of these.
So I'm going to formally start this now. Yeah. So I'm going to welcome everybody to the webinar, and the webinar is on how to build financial sustainability. It's going to be myself, and it's going to be Marcus from the team at Moore Kingston Smith. And, I'm just really looking forward to helping you think about financial sustainability, especially, with the impact of COVID-19 and what's that done to your finances. So Marcus and myself will present. Marcus, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, so I'm Marcus Lees-Millay. I've been with Moore Kingston Smith since about January time. And prior to that, I worked at Cass Business School, where I was doing the same sort of things I'm doing now at Moore Kingston Smith. So all things charity finance, whether that be cost recovery, finance function reviews, business modeling, that sort of thing. Lots of Excel. And prior to that, I was at PwC, where I qualified as an auditor, as an accountant even. And
myself, I had spent 13 years as a finance director, and then into Cass Business School, where I was running the financial sustainability work, and it came from social investment. So that's where I built it. And hopefully we're going to help you to understand, some of the learning from that, but also some of the new learning that we've got recently. Now, the only problem that I've got is I can't move the slides. So Marcus, when I tell you if you can move the slides, we're going to do some introductions very quickly. We'll get into the basics then of financial sustainability. We can't realistically do, financial sustainability at the moment without touching on cash flow. It's incredibly important. And then a lot of the charities that we're working with, service delivery charities, particularly cost recovery, is very important. So we're just going to touch on that today. If you want to have more, you can go back and look at another presentation we did a couple of weeks ago. Management information, we're then going to do a quick summarize of what we've learned. And then we're just going to open it up to everybody so we can join in the conversation. That's what we're going to do. But before we move forward, I just want to frame what we're going to talk about. In the UN, they talk about sustainability of organizations. There are 15 different types of sustainability. So sustainability of impact, sustainability of legal, sustainability of people's voice. But today we're going to talk about financial sustainability. So it's really important to understand that financial sustainability gives us the money to do what we do in the world. So it gives us the money to actually, change people's lives. It gives us the money to help people. It gives us the money to help the environment. And so we should never forget, when we're talking just money, there's something behind this money. And that change we're going to call impact. Let's not forget about impact. I think the second thing is I've been talking for a number of years about financial sustainability, and I don't believe people have taken this seriously enough in the past. I think that a lot of the charities that I've worked with have not been sustainable, have not been financially sustainable. Add now on COVID-19 to this, and I think we've got a perfect storm. I think that when you look at the financial sustainability of some organizations, it's being tested to the limit. And so we're going to talk about that today, and how you can practically help yourself and think about this. At an extreme level, Ronnie Cohen, who invented social investment, and as part of the UN task group, this is part of the G8 summit, said, look, I'm going to look at the charity sector and look at financial sustainability of the charity sector. And he came back saying, actually quite a large number of organizations were not sustainable. So it's something we have needed to address for a time, and we're going to actually help you to think about that today. Marcus, next slide. So just to introduce who we are as a team very quickly, you've got Marcus and myself from the finance side. We do business models, cost recovery, finance models. You've got Carl, Penny, and Helen in terms of impact. They can help match up the finances and the impact, but more to the point, talk about the outcomes and valuing that, and how do you talk about the change that you create in the world. And then Dan and Emma on the right-hand side there, funding reviews, strategic fundraising support, and all things fundraising. Next slide, Marcus. And we used to leave this slide right at the very end, but we're just going to put it up front today because we're trying to make a difference. We run a series of webinars. This is one of those webinars. There's going to be other ones coming up. So fundraising, impactful fundraising, and unlikely partnership, fundraising and finance working together. Those are coming up. And on the right-hand side here, you've got all of the work that we've done, all of the webinars that we've run. These are all available for you. You can go onto MKS website, you can download them, you can watch them. It's all there for you. And if you want to get in contact with us, we'll send around the slides afterwards. impact@mks.co.uk. That's where you'll find us. So, Marcus, onto the next page. So, in pulling together the session today, what I wanted to do was first of all talk about money. And for me, money is like water. Yeah. And what happens is if you move it in one place, it comes in a different place. So for example, if you move the income and expenditure, then something happens to reserves. If you move the amount of unrestricted you have, then the balance between restricted and unrestricted changes. If you spend some of your money on a fixed asset, well, you have more fixed assets and potentially less unrestricted. It's like water, something happens. So when you move money, it moves. And so next slide. I always like to think about this with a little story. And those that have heard me lecture before have seen the story. I'm sorry, I'm just going to go through it again for those that haven't heard it. This is a group of village savings and loan schemes, or the ladies here are, organized a village savings and loan scheme. And they're very poor people in Ethiopia. So they really are low income country and also the poorest of the poor. And so they are charcoal sellers. They burn wood and they sell wood. And they've come together here to actually lend money to each other, to spread their resources, to help each other to create small businesses. Yeah? And they have 4 bowls in front of them at the start of the village savings and loan scheme, and the box is full of money. And so at the start of the village savings and loan scheme, people count out the money into the red bowl. So you can see the red bowl on the left-hand side. They count out how much money they've got. That's the level of reserves that the village saving and loan scheme has. When people come to put money in because they want to make an investment here, they put it into the orange bowl, and that actually puts money into the box. And then when they take a loan from it, it's the blue bowl. That's where the money comes from, or gets taken out to make loans. So you've got red bowl, which is reserves, orange bowl, which is money in, blue bowl, which is money out. And then the pink bowl is interesting. The pink bowl is where the group will actually give money to those that are less fortunate than themselves in the community, so that they will actually help each other, and those less fortunate will get money from the pink bowl. So it's like charity. It's the, if you like, the impact of our work, and where the money then gets spent. So if you're thinking about it, we've got money in, money out, we've got our reserves, and what we do with that money, that's impact. And it's exactly the same in charity finance, Marcus, yeah? And this is what I want to say, which is going to start to keep this really simple. I have helped, I don't know, probably 100, 200 charities with their business models, and each time it's come back to the same. Understanding the dynamics of how money flows. So back to how money flows. Income and expenditure. Do you understand how income and expenditure work together? Yeah. Do you understand how income and expenditure then move, for example, in your reserves, the bottom right-hand side here? Yeah. Looking at your reserves, and let's say income goes up, well, your reserves will go up too. But is it unrestricted reserves or is it restricted reserves? You've got to be thinking about these things, yeah? Balance sheet. You've got, assets there which you can leverage. Well, if you're starting a new business, or you're starting something new and you don't have the balance sheet there to invest, how are you going to drive that expenditure? Yeah, it's really important to think about this. And then the final thing that I think organizations and charities quite often forget about is cash flow, because all of this can be in, if you like, theoretical money, debtors, creditors, fixed assets, etc., or it can be in real tangible, the cash in your hand. And you can be an organization with lots and lots of restricted funds, but have to close because you've just got no unrestricted. So understanding this balance between income, expenditure, cash flow, balance sheet, reserves are the building blocks for us starting to think about financial sustainability. So I'm gonna focus first of all on income and expenditure, and then we're going to go through these other areas to start to help you think about it. And this is going to be at pace because there's a lot to talk about here. Yeah. We're going to do the next two slides, and then we're going to just open it up for a bit of a conversation. So Marcus, the next slide. Now, when I was at Care International, and when I was, at Cats Protection, and when I was at other charities before, I never got this. I never understood this. And it was probably 8 years into my finance director career that I suddenly went, oh, I get it. Yeah. And that's the thing, that you have to spend money to make money. Yeah. So what we have to do is we have to spend money to make money. It's a simple thing, but in the non-profit sector, in charities, we sometimes forget about this dynamic completely. Whereas a commercial organization would see it as natural, that you spend your money on marketing and that generates your sales. Yeah. Well, if you think about how we start to, spend our money, it might be on fundraising. Yeah. Or it might be on grants and contracts and generating a portfolio of grants and contracts. But you've got to spend money to make money. Okay, so Marcus, if you can just give me the next box. And here's the thing, yeah? There's a different return on investment for everything you spend. So if you are talking about fundraising spend and you are going to cold call people, it's not going to be the same as an existing portfolio of donors that that are very warm. So for example, with COVID-19, and you're going to get money from donations from fundraising at the moment, where are you going to turn to? You're going to turn to your warm donors. And so understanding the return on investment that you get for your fundraising spend, both with existing and acquisitive, where you're acquiring new donors, it's incredibly important to think about that. Yeah. Equally, it might be a fundraising event that you're running. Well, fundraising income that's only going to be once. But actually, if you've got regular givers, that might be multiple times. So this understanding the return on investment that you get for the money you spend and then the money it makes is really important. I think for service delivery charities, though, there's another dynamic here, and it's the grants and contracts spend here. And you can see that, the little bubble at the top left bar there. We grossly, obviously this is a generalization, but we quite often totally underestimate how much time it takes to fundraise for grants and contracts. So, for simple example, the time spent in relationship building by the chief executive or the senior management team or managers, for example, is quite often not included in there. Or you've maybe got 2 grant or contract fundraisers or 3, and one of them, leaves the organization, and people wonder why the grants and contracts income has gone down so much. It's because actually, if you see this small box, it creates a large amount of project income. Yeah, so Marcus might be able to highlight, with the pointer, project income and overhead recovery at the top of that box there. And so when you generate a grant or a contract, you're going to get an overhead recovery, yeah, and you're going to get project income to do the work that you want to do. But if you don't understand the return on investment, you can't even start to go on this journey, yeah? So then comes the question, how do you spend your money? Yeah. And one of the things that I always find interesting is that here's overheads at the far right-hand side. And then you've got your program management staff, and then you've got your programs. Sorry, by the way, I didn't say this at the start of the slide, but this is just a simple example of, for example, a charity that does fundraising and has some grants and contracts. It's not meant to represent every charity. Yeah. So back to overheads. That's the overhead bit on the far right-hand side, that small dark red box on the right-hand side. And when there's a financial downturn, etc., people say we're gonna focus on our overheads. That's already small already. What about the rest of the spend? What about driving our fundraising harder? What about maintaining our grants and contracts income? There's a whole load of other questions that we can ask ourselves, and understanding the balance between each of these areas is the true magic. Now, there's another very interesting thing around this when you start to look. It's about fixed and variable costs. Because if you look at the fixed cost, your overhead costs can't easily be changed. Your program staff can't easily be changed. Well, actually, you're not going to cut back on your overhead recovery and your project income, which means that fundraising spend on grants and contracts doesn't change that much either, yeah? If you think about it, the only bit that a lot of charities turn to is turning off and on their fundraising spend. And what's the fundraising do for you? It provides for your future income. So you're going to have your own model for your organization. It's going to look different for every organization, but just understanding the interplay of income and expenditure and the fact that you have to spend money to make money, it's the basis of financial sustainability, okay? So I've got a couple of quick questions, and then I'm going to open it to the audience. So Marcus, if you go to the next page. So here's the question. How do we know and do we understand how we use unrestricted funds and how we spend those? Next question down. Do we understand our balance sheets and how we can get them used effectively, and how we can sweat some of those balance sheet assets to provide for investment or against our spending plans? Next bullet down, do we understand the variability of income and expenditure and how it plays on that previous 3-bar diagram? I mean, a small variance in income, for example, in terms of the amount of money you get from programs or from projects, has a huge implication for the rest of the organization. And the final thing is the split of fixed costs and variable costs. I mean, so we're going to open up we've never done this before. It's the first time we've used Zoom. We just want to kind of try it out. So we're just going to open it up. If anybody's got a comment or something to add to this list that's really important that they think about when they're thinking about their finances and sustainability, over to you. So who wants to go? Who wants to go next? Or who wants to give us a comment from the audience?
So I think there's a chat box down the bottom or a Q&A where you can answer questions. Perfect. Here we go. Rick Tazzini has said, do you think trustees understand the importance of a reserves policy that is regularly reviewed?
I mean, I think, Rick, that trustees don't always understand the importance of a reserves policy, but I think that reserves policy, we're going to come and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but it's both for positive and negative risk. So let's say you've got a variability in your income, or you're going to have to spend a little bit more. That's negative risk. Yeah, you're setting aside money just in case something happens. On the flip side, you might want to have investment money, and being able to invest and grow for the future. And this is the thing that worries me about the response to COVID-19. That when you are actually looking at COVID-19, people are going to start cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting. If you don't invest, you're not going to build your unrestricted income. You're not going to build your income. So getting that balance is really important. The other question you asked, Rick, is really also important about free reserves. And free reserves where you actually have, an asset which is able to be used quickly versus an asset that actually is not used. Yeah, so for example, a building, you can't just sell a building quickly. And yet, if you're calling all of those unrestricted reserves able to be sold and used immediately, it's hiding things, isn't it? And you could have an organization that's just got a very big building but no cash, still having to close because you couldn't borrow against that. So I think the idea of free reserves, and that's unrestricted less your fixed assets, is a really important concept because it really shows you what you can leverage for your organization. Do you have any advice on how to make the case for investment in fundraising versus commercial, when return on fundraising investment can often take longer to deliver? This is for Sarah. Yes, I think the fact that, I think three things. I think the first is, in commercial, you're going to get some money back. I think that donors like to see that there is a legacy being left for the future. There's an interesting case study which is from I think it's anyway, it's a social investment organization that took 22 million US dollars, and they invested that in philanthropy, and they bought solar lamps.
Acumen.
Acumen, thank you. So Acumen took 22 million US dollars and bought solar lamps. It cost them 40 pounds each to buy and distribute. They helped 2.86 million people. What they then did was they invested in a number of commercial entities, in fact 12. 2 of them failed. They had 10 different businesses then left. And what they did was they used those in low-income countries to make the solar lamps. At the end of 2 years, they helped 86 million people. So I think the case for investment of recycling this money plays really powerfully into this case for investment support when you're going to donors. Yeah, I hope that's answered your question, Sarah. Also, legacies. It's interesting. Legacies on average take 8 to 10 years to return. Back to the return on investment question again. How long does it take? It's really important. How long it's going to take before you pay back. Yeah. Marcus, is there? Should we just open it up to anybody who wants to raise a?
Yeah. We have one more point, a chat that's come in, where Addy has said, you alluded to this earlier, the difference between accounting unrestricted reserves and actual cash flow, unrestricted cash available to spend or to use for planning. What's the best way to make this point?
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting. There's 3 different parts to this, Addy. Yeah. The first part to this is reserves themselves, and the law says you can't use the money if it's restricted money for purposes that it's not meant for. So in other words, money is given to you in trust. It's held for a certain purpose. You can't use it for any other purpose. And let's say you're building a building and you've got money for the walls. Well, you can't necessarily use it for the ceiling. Yeah. So I think the first thing is understanding the breakdown of what you can and can't do with restricted funds. And actually, it's really interesting. You can quite often get around the restriction by finding somebody who can help you understand that. So, for example, if with restricted funds it says, we wish this money is to be used in this way, well, it's not really restricted money. If, on the other hand, somebody says it's my last will and testament that this money should be used for cats in Southampton and for no other purpose, it pretty much has to be used in that way. So the reason why I'm taking you down the reserves route, first of all, is people tend to pool all of their money. They tend to just bung reserves, restricted and unrestricted together. That's not strictly right, because, ultimately you have to answer the case of how you've used your restricted and how you've used your unrestricted. And yet we tend to, just as custom and practice, bung it all together in one big cash account. So the first thing, Adi, I'd say is understanding how you've got your restricted money being generated and how you're unrestricted and what the balance of that is. The second thing about cash flow, I've always gone to a donor, let's say, for example, with DFID, and said, can we have a mobilization payment? A mobilization payment that will enable us to get started and to give us cash flow to move in that way, Adi. So I hope that was a long and rambling answer. I'm sorry that I wasn't very direct there. I'm going to have to move on here now. I'm going to move on to Marcus and just say, Simon, Jay, love the questions. Keep them coming. We'll come back to those at the end. Okay, over to you, Marcus.
Perfect. So now we're going to move further down that list that Mark had shown of the different bowls, and we're going to talk about cash flow and why that's important within your organizations for financial sustainability, particularly at times like this when more and more charities are starting to feel that pinch. And what we often found is in our work with different charities is that in terms of management information reporting, many people said, oh yeah, we do our monthly or quarterly, whatever it is, P&L download, but that we don't necessarily do a cash flow. And oftentimes we would say, well, actually, this is something that you probably should be looking at, particularly if you're dealing with restricted and unrestricted funds, because rather than, as Mark said, lumping it all into one pot, and then at the year end, having your auditors go through it to untangle it all and work out what your restricted and unrestricted reserves picture is. In theory, if you've been given restricted funds, you cannot be using those for unrestricted purposes, even if come the year end, it's all sort of somehow worked itself out at the end. And so having a cash flow to work out what you're going to be spending, what's coming down the track towards you, versus what you actually have in the bank is really, really valuable and important. And on the next page, we're going to look at 3 different cash flow profiles, as it were. So this is just to bear in mind when you think about the work that you're doing. So here we've got contracts, donations, and grants. But the question is which one is which? So number 1 there is for donations. You receive a bunch of money, and this may be a legacy. You receive an amount of income arrives into your organization, and then you steadily spend that money away for the purpose in which it was given. However, what this graph doesn't capture is what Mark was just talking about before, is that time and money you've had to spend before that to actually get that money. You've had to be going out, doing some marketing for your organization to make sure that you're in people's minds when they're thinking of leaving a legacy. You're having to employ a fundraiser, those sort of things. And that's often not taken into account when looking at this sort of thing, but it's worth remembering. Number 2 here is a grant. So this is where you may start a piece of work up front at the start and you spend a little bit, but generally with grants, you're given some money up front or shortly after you start the project to undertake the work. And as Mark said before, a mobilization payment would help with this short amount here where you're having to spend before you've received any money. Whereas if you got the mobilization payment, you'd then be spending down and always staying above the line. And this is showing how when you spend down to the end of the time of a grant, you come to the year end where you're having to maybe try and renew that grant and rebid for it to get that money again to keep doing the work that you're doing. But that generally you're staying by and large above the line for the most part, and you're getting the money in to then spend the grant again. There's been a big shift over the past decade, really, from grants towards contracts, and that's what we've got at the bottom here. So a contract is often a payment by results, or you are paid towards the end of the work. So as you can see here, you're spending and spending and spending, undertaking the work and your program delivery, but you've yet to actually get that money in at the end of the piece of work. And if you haven't got a cash flow, then if you've got multiple different projects going on, which are running multiple different grants, multiple different contracts, you've got a very, very complex picture of cash within your organization. And the timing occasionally may not be in your favor. If you have several contracts that all start at once, but that other grant hasn't come in from the other project, you need to have that visibility of what's coming up ahead of you and what you're likely to have to spend, just to make sure that you're keeping those reserves above that line that you've set yourself and how you're going to best spend them. Or if you're going to be having to dip below that, at least you have the knowledge that that's coming, that, okay, in the next quarter or the next month, we're probably going to have to dip into our reserves more than we may like at this point. But we can see after that, that's okay, because that grant is coming in or that contract will be finished. So we'll be getting another slug of income. So having that forward-looking direction with a cash flow is really, really important for how to measure your financial sustainability as an organization. And on the next page, we're going to say what we typically see as a budgeted cash flow. So at the bottom, you can see people know how they're spending their money. And so here you've got a very accurate picture of how cash is being spent. So they know that in July there's not a huge amount being spent, but in June there's quite a lot being spent, etc., etc. And this really shows the seasonality of the spend. However, in terms of budgeting for the income that's coming in, like I just said before, using a cash flow, you want to know about what's coming down the line, that contract finishes, this grant starts, etc. Instead, many organizations that we see simply take their year's worth of income, divide it by 12, and then have their expenditure sitting against that. So you've got all your costs down here, whereas up here, you've just got a year's worth of income divided by 12. This doesn't take into account the seasonality of work that we do. For example, if you're a client like an Age UK who does a handy person garden service, you're not going to have much need for that service in the wintertime. And so being able to actually budget your cash flow in a more accurate manner and really capture the intricacies of the cash and your incomings and outgoings is going to really help you in terms of being able to look at your financial sustainability in a more accurate or helpful light, rather than a simple year's worth of income divided by 12. As we said, we're having to go through this at fairly good pace because we've got quite a lot to cover, and we want time to have questions at the end of this. So this next section here, cost recovery, we're gonna whistle through at a fair pace because we've done an entire webinar on this. So if you want more information on cost recovery, either get in touch with us or have a look at the existing webinar that is already up on our website, and the link will be being sent out as well. So with cost recovery, what we're trying to do, as this diagram here shows, is move as much of your indirect cost or your overheads, those costs that don't link to your activity or services, above that line into your service delivery costs. So we're trying to move as much cost from down here in your indirect costs, we're trying to move it up into your service delivery costs, your direct costs. And this may be something like premises, which you're often classifying as an indirect cost or an overhead, but in actual fact, it's used for your service delivery. So there's a real cost to the service of that building and that sort of thing. So this is a very, very simple, quick run through of what cost recovery is, and it's trying to get as many of your costs above that line within reason, so that you have a better chance of recovering that indirect cost percentage that you've got left. and including a profit or contingency at the bottom in pricing. But it's more than that. It's also about transparency, both internally and externally. And so as the next slide is going to show, this here is a good start, but it's not terribly transparent. So this is an example of some internal management information at a client that we have worked with, where they had several services here, and you can see, oh, okay, service 1 making a profit, service 2 making a profit, everything's making a profit here except for workshops and training. All these others are profitable. Oh, we've got some office costs and stuff, but we'll forget about those. Oh, and as an organization, we're making a slight loss. But each person will generally be looking at their particular service to go, yep, service 1 is profitable, etc., etc. But in actual fact, this is not taking into account those indirect costs, those overheads in that orange box. And what you should really be doing is spreading those costs across your services to show the true cost of the work that you're doing, because those overheads are what provide the platform for you to deliver your services, that infrastructure platform that, finance help you get management information out to see how many people you're reaching, or to enable your different service leads to prepare their budgets each year. Your CEO runs the entire organization, etc., etc. And so by spreading those indirect costs over everything, you get a very different picture here. So workshops and training, we can see makes a much bigger loss than it previously did. Everything else is looking. Service 2 is just positive, just surplus making, but not by much. And service 1, having been a healthy, profitable service before, we can see is actually making a slight loss overall. And so this can be really useful for both those service leads and for management themselves when making decisions about what services do we need to be reviewing and looking at. Do we need to be scaling up services, scaling back services, etc., etc. But this is only telling half the story, because you do still need to be looking at the impact that you're reaching. Workshops and conferences and training may be a loss-making service, but in actual fact, it could be very wide-reaching and very impactful, and something that really brings people in through the door who then take up your services. So when looking at this sort of thing, it's about tying the financial and non-financial information together. But from a cost recovery standpoint, this here is just giving you the true cost of each service, and really giving you a more transparent picture of what it's really costing you to do the work that you're doing. And with that, I'm going to hand you back to Mark to tidy us up before we get on to some questions at the end.
Cool. So can you hear me, by the way?
Yep, loud and clear.
Cool. So we're now back on reserves. And people have been asking questions as we've been going through this, so I'm going to try and answer one of the questions here. So if you go to the next page, Marcus, reserves, and somebody's asked the question: how do we move away from just a straight 3 months worth of reserves policy? In other words, we're setting aside a reserves policy at the moment quite often just based on 3 months worth of expenditure. Well, you do it by looking at the risks. So, for example, if income is going to change, and you've got an idea of the variability of income, that's very clear then how much you might want to set aside for income. Equally, if expenditure is going to change, you might want to set aside a certain amount for that. I talked before about the need to put aside reserves for example, investment. That's another side of things. And then you might want to have set aside money for cash flow. So the way that you develop this under, I think it's CC12, in the past, it was, reserves policies were very much done around just putting aside a certain number of months worth of expenditure. Now it's best practice to actually link to your risks. Yeah. So what I've given you here in terms of the diagram is what Marcus and myself spend a lot of our time doing, really. And this is twofold. Firstly, the picture that Marcus played a couple of slides ago showing the profitability per service, but then helping organizations to look forward and understand what happens when they start to change their model. So for example, here, if the charity didn't do anything to change their model, it would just go down on this red line, yeah? And so in other words, potentially losing money month on month on month on month. And I mean, especially with COVID-19, this is what we're seeing. But by stopping some services and by investing in other services, you see here, you've got the blue line. It's investing. So in other words, it's dipping into the reserves to actually then drive that forward, hopefully to turn the organization around. But you've got to have the investment reserves to be able to do that. Yeah. And so reserves, we don't have a huge amount of time to go through them, but reserves in themselves are incredibly, important, and also quite difficult to get right. Yeah. So I again, we don't have huge amounts of time, but I just want to stop here now and say, I've taken you through, and Marcus has taken you through, income and expenditure, cash flow, how you actually, charge your infrastructure and your overhead costs and your reserves. Taking you back to the bowl, the bowls with the Ethiopian ladies, money in, money out, reserves, and what you do with the money. This is what we've talked you through. Yeah. So if you're going to actually get your financial sustainability right, it's about getting the balance between all of these right. Marcus, next slide. And to do this, good management information is absolutely key. And I think, Marcus and myself spend a lot of time looking at management information that isn't powerful, yeah, because it doesn't tell you how much money you're making per service line or what the deficit that's being generated per service line is. And then there's another thing which is really missed by a lot of organizations. It's what drives the numbers. So if you just go to the next slide, Marcus, is your organization really understanding, for example, what drives your charity? Is it income or expenditure? Is it the number of number of grants or contracts, or the number of service users that's really driving the finances of your organization? On the right-hand side here, do you have some measures to help you? So for example, your cost recovery percentage or your profit versus surplus. What about value for money? We're going to come back to management information another time because it's so important. And we often see really poor management information. Yeah. So if you go to the next slide, Marcus, I'm just going to go to the final slide. Yeah. And we've had a lot of people in the chat room here asking us questions about COVID-19. Yeah. I see that COVID-19 will get over it, and in the future will come back, but the charity sector will not be the same. Yeah, it will have changed. There's a great question from Jay. At the moment, how much do we spend on fundraising? Well, Jay, it's a great question, because if you spend nothing, then you'll have nothing for the future. But if you spend money, and let's say, the number of years that it'll pay back over is so long, it's just not going to help you. Maybe you can't invest your fundraising money now. Maybe you need to go digital with it, or maybe you need to focus on events. A lot of organizations that we tend to work with also miss the blindingly obvious, that you spend fundraising money on, for example, a warm group of donors that are very closely associated with your work because you've never done it before. It's a good return on investment. And yet a lot of organizations will throw money upon money upon money against cold leads. In this type of environment at the moment, that might not work. Yeah. So understanding, how you spend money to make your money, but also being realistic around that. And for example, the Institute of Fundraising and others have some really good return on investment figures, and they're able to tell you at the moment how much, the fundraising returns have been hit. Now, I'm going to quote something here. You'll have to go back and look at your own stats. But typical figures for fundraising in terms of long-term metrics is about 3 to 1. So for every pound you spend, you get £3 back. What we're seeing at the moment is about 1.8, 1.5 to 1. From the work we've been doing, and also from the work on people like NFP Synergy. So Jay, your question is a great question. How much do you spend on fundraising now? Well, if you don't spend anything, you won't have anything for the future. But if you spend it on things that just aren't generating the return, is that just throwing good money after bad? It's a great question at the moment, yeah. And then there's another question here about predictable income streams. And how do you tell a cash flow at the moment? How do you do your prediction in terms of income? And this is where the art really is. I mean, I often get people tell me that you can't predict legacies. Yeah, well, you can predict legacies, and you can say, okay, percentage-wise, I expect to get in the average year, let's say 50% of this legacy figure, and I can be pretty certain I'm going to get that, but I can't say that I'm going to get 95 or 100% of that with certainty. Maybe you have to go back and start to break down how much you think you're really going to get. In other words, if you look at your fundraising budget and you're certain that you're going to get 95% of it, great. If you're not, budget down and then look at what the implications of that is. The work that I did at CAS Business School shows that predictable income streams, though, is everything. If you don't have predictable income streams, the charity will feel very vulnerable. And so it's understanding what your predictable income streams are. That's incredibly important for financial sustainability.
Yeah.
So we're going to...
So go for it, Mark. I was going to just hop onto that and say that as part of that cash flow, when you have so many unknowns, doing some form of sensitivity analysis can be really important, where Mark was saying, we may get this legacy and we may not. What does your perfect storm scenario look like? What does it look like if income is less than we think, if our expenditure stays the same, if, and to start building up that picture to go, okay, well, it could look like this, it could look like this, it could look something in between, and being able to have a best case scenario, a worst case scenario, an expected scenario could be what helps give you that little bit of wiggle room to know the likely road that you're going down, but to be able to plan for the worst road in case that happens. And so it's not just a simple question of inputting the numbers that are going to happen. There's that bit of sensitivity of going, okay, well, actually, this could be 20% higher, this could be 20% lower, etc., etc.
Can we turn on microphones so that people can talk to us on the Zoom? I mean, so that we can just really go for it and just push it, because I'd love to hear people just give us the questions.
I don't think so. We can chat with people, but I don't think we can unmute them because it's just us as panelists and everyone else as attendees, I'm afraid.
Okay, great. So we need. I mean, I'm sorry. I thought we're going to have a conversation this afternoon. It's going to be on chat. So we fire away on your questions. Marcus and myself will answer your questions. We've got about 10 minutes to answer questions now, and then we'll just wrap up at the end of this. So please, your questions.
Did we answer Simon's question about reserves policy and some pointers as to what we should look at, or even a template to follow, or is that something you want to come back to later?
No, Simon, we certainly did. When I got to the reserve policy slide, if you remember, what I said is you're looking at the variability of income, the variability of expenditure, any one-off events that might come. You're looking at your cash flow. You're looking at, for example, how much you might invest. And it's a risk-based approach that you're taking, including the money you might want to put into investment, Simon. And then what you're doing is you're saying, okay, here's a figure, let's say £500,000. But you know that not all of that is going to happen at the same time. So you might feel comfortable saying, okay, well, we got a cash flow balance. That's fine. Yeah, I don't need to have money, therefore, to worry about my income variability. So I can hold £350,000. And that's what I'm going to hold as my reserves policy. So reserves policy's changed. I think it's in CC 12, the Charity Commission Guidance Note 12, to talk about risk-based approaches. And it's just easy, Simon, to just go through and map these out. And reserves policies are also quite, a lovely art as well, because you have to decide how much you're going to hold, with some sensitivity analysis as well. Simon, you're actually here. Can you talk to us?
Yeah, no, thank you very much indeed. So we've traditionally, I work for a simple, relatively straightforward fundraising charity, and we've had a 3-month operating costs reserves policy for a long time. I'd like to take that right down, because we have some very steady income streams but of course we've had the pandemic recently showing a lot of risk. So I like the idea of building some risk in and talking about our income streams to offset the possibility of a rainy day. So what you're saying is very helpful, and I'll go back and have a look through CC12.
And if it's not CC12 and I've got the wrong number, I do apologise, because I'm not very good with my CC numbers. Thank you, Simon, for coming on and just talking. It makes it far more human.
Yeah.
Richard's got a great question. Can we unmute Richard so that he can talk to us? Do you think that's possible? Richard, welcome. If you can just unmute yourself, you've got a great question here. Do you want to put it in context, Richard?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. I work for a large charity, which over the last number of years has predictably had deficit budgets year on year, supported by fairly large legacy and investment reserves. So I just wondered if anybody had any guidance as how you can convince somebody that they need to start doing or need to perhaps stop doing something to revert more to a surplus budget, so that we can rebuild those reserves which have been somewhat depleted due to COVID-19.
So shall I have a go at this one, Marcus, or do you want to have a go at it?
Go for it. You start away and I'll hop in if I need to.
So Richard, this is a great question, especially with COVID-19 at the moment. The first thing is somebody has to pay. And this is what scares me and worries me the most, that actually, if you don't have the money, but you keep trying to do the same amount of activity, something has to pay. Well, either that means that reserves have to go down, or you impinge and ask people through goodwill to work harder and longer hours. So I've always worried about, for example, cost recovery, that if you don't get your cost recovery right, it plays into overtime and people having to work harder. The second thing, Richard, is what I really believe in, that we are social purpose organizations that create change. If we don't understand, the impact of what we do, we really can't understand what we stop and what we continue. So if we're just looking at the money, we have to go back and do the work that Marcus showed, which is income less expenditure, allocate a portion of overheads, and you see whether it makes a surplus or deficit, and then you make your choice from there. But it doesn't say whether it changes people's lives or whether that service is impactful or not. So there's another side to this equation. You have to go back and look at impact. And my colleagues and ourselves have done a lot of work mapping the finances onto the impact, so that we can stop those things that are neither impactful nor financially sustainable. And then the final thing is, at CARE we had the same problem. People didn't want to stop doing things. And so what we did was we turned it on its head. We said, right, we're going to have a list of things that we must do. And the things that we're going to fund are going to be the must do things. And it's funny when it gets down to those things that maybe you mustn't do, sorry, you don't necessarily have to do, or we could do. Suddenly when the money isn't there any longer, people stop doing it, yeah? Or if they think it's really important, it comes back with a different guise. So for example, water and sanitation work came back under women's menstrual health because suddenly you had to actually have fresh water and clean water for women and sanitation. I hope that helps you, Richard, see how you actually start into that question. But it's a bloody good question. I would start looking at impact and mapping it off against the surplus or deficit per service stream. Richard, you're back on that.
Yeah, I was trying to encourage people to use that 2x2 matrix, the financial sustainability and impact matrix.
Oh, I love that matrix, yeah.
Which working quite well for kind of the services type approach. But I was wondering if there are any models or way in which you could use that for more the support services. So how would you place, I don't know, finance department or personnel onto that matrix to more of a kind of effectiveness and efficiency kind of impact? Are there any kind of existing models or methods?
Yeah, there are lots. I mean, Marcus, do you want to talk about the pyramid for finance, for example?
Yeah, so one way that we look at finance is we establish what they actually do with their time. So we make a triangle that has different layers to it. And so at the bottom layer, you've got the basic bookkeeping function, the transaction processing. And then sitting on top of that, you have the control function, the undertaking bank reconciliations, the kind of purchase order pay process, etc. Sitting above that, you have and we're slowly getting more and more value adding for the organization as you get higher and higher up this triangle. And then above that would be the reporting, management information, those areas. So you're providing information to others outside of just the finance team. You're helping the organization to see, as you were just saying, of what services are making money, not making money, what are we spending, etc. And then at the very top, you had the strategic input. So you've got finance being part of the decision making of deciding the strategic direction for the organization, being involved in key decisions of scaling up, scaling down, starting, stopping services, that sort of thing, and having finance being really involved at the top level in all those things. And so we would then look at the time spent by a finance function at those different levels and see how the split of time that they are spending lines up with what we think an organization of that size could and should be spending their time at. Do they need more time up at the strategic level? And generally, we see that the vast majority of time is being spent down in transaction processing and maybe controls, but that reporting and strategic input is much, much lower in a finance function than an organization potentially needs to have that greater input from finance. And so doing an exercise like that can be really helpful for seeing where you could improve on your finance function, and are you getting value from the spend that you're spending on your finance team, say.
And so, Richard, it's interesting what we tend to do is we map the percentage time that you're going to spend from your finance function, and then you map where you would like to be in the future, and you can see then the change in percentages and where you've got to invest to move that, or what changes you've got to make. And also the final bit of that is what non-value added processes you've got that you might want to stop. Yeah. But I mean, brown papering and changing and identifying non-value added processes is a different webinar. We'll come back to process efficiency another day. But just literally taking that triangle, mapping out where you are now and mapping out where you want to be, and then talking about how you invest in that, it's probably the most powerful thing. Marcus, I think we've got time for one more question, and I'm going to take the one from Carl, and then we'll wrap up. I'm so sorry that we've got very limited more time. Carl says, you mentioned often management information is poor. Do you have any specific recommendations of MI software that dovetails with, say, Sage, that can build financial and non-financial KPIs? Carl, this has a red flashing light all over it for me, yeah? Because trying to put MI software that does both financial and non-financial information, I've tried to do it at 3 places and I've failed, yeah? And so I think, you have a choice. If you want to get a piece of financial or piece of management information software that interrogates financial and non-financial information, you have to put in place a middleware. You have to put in place a database. And then, things like you could have a SQL database, and SQL reporting tools are very, very powerful for getting out financial and non-financial. But if you try and bolt them straight on the side of your finance machine like Sage, you'll just fail in my book. Yeah. There are lots of good finance management reporting bits of software that will bolt onto Sage. I think Sage has its own reporting package, but it's only financial. Other ones, you've got Crystal, you've got Navision. Tableau does something which is really good for fundraising. It depends what you want. Yeah. But the red flashing light for me is, don't try and put financial and non-financial KPIs through a reporting piece of software unless you're going to build a piece of middleware. In other words, a database there, like a SQL database to be able to report from. I hope that answers that question. And if anybody's got good software, type it in there now. We'd love to know. So just type it in there if you've got to help Carl. we're done, Marcus. Do you want to summarise or say anything to finish, or shall I just?
I was just very quickly trying to type some replies to a couple of the other questions that we've had come in while you were answering that one. But I suppose all that is left for me to say is thanks very much for everyone for joining, and to watch this space, because as we said, some of these ones that we've touched upon, management information, we'll be coming back to in more detail, and we've had some questions specifically about that. Or cost recovery. We breezed through that in a couple of minutes, but we've got a full hour-long webinar that we've already done on that. So just watch this space, because there will be more coming from us that hopefully ties into the financial sustainability area, while giving you a bit more detail about a specific bit and giving a bit more of a deep dive.
And the summary from myself is, go back to that diagram. With the way that you make and generate your income and the way you spend your income, and understand the dynamics. And we've got a water-based slide. We leave you with a water-based slide because it's like water. If you get more income, you can do more to help beneficiaries. If you have more expenditure, your reserves will go down. So forgive me, I'm waving my hand around in front of the screen, but it really is all linked. And once you understand that it's all linked, and that you push in one way, it changes something else, you'll be able to get to financial sustainability much more easily. If we can help you with any of these questions, come back to Marcus and myself. We'd love to help you. And just I hope you've got something from the session. First time we've used Zoom as well, so feedback on Zoom would be useful. Richard and Simon, thank you for being our voices, and wish you love and luck. See you next webinar. Thank you.